Greetings, my name is Michael Cook. I'm an application developer, design artist, and system engineer, and in this particular video, I'm going to be covering the topic of optimistic existentialism. Optimistic existentialism, September 29, 2023. Introduction. Existentialism, noun, a philosophical theory or approach which emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent, determining their own development through acts of the will. Optimistic, adjective, hopeful and confident about the future. On September 26, 2023, I responded to a post on Facebook written by a friend of mine, Corey Betts, who I used to play Quake with many, many years ago. For many years, I hadn't kept in touch with him through no fault of my own or his. I believe that is because in life, many of the friends a person meets along the way, they may wind up becoming more and more distant, taking separate paths along this labyrinth of obstacles we call our lives. In summary, I suppose that is because life is rather unpredictable. That said, I'm going to unpack and examine the post he wrote because I fear younger generations are having more and more difficulty in asking basic questions about their existence, but it also applies to my generation and even older. I consider many philosophical implications that require an understanding of these many various components I've described thus far, which is essentially the core component of existentialism. Premise. There were a lot of takeaways in his post, much like the subject I had learned in school. But before I post what was stated, I'm going to continue to talk about the premise of this document, as I believe that our society is riddled with problems that are resultant to a clear and lack of empathy and communication, and this stuff isn't likely to be covered at great breadth, scope, and length by the education system. Unless, of course, you're talking about clinical psychologist professors like Jordan Peterson, neurological scientists like Robert Sapolsky, linguistic master Noam Chomsky, socioeconomic advisor like Jeremy Rifkin, and even famous comedian and storyteller, the late and great George Carlin. But even then, when professors such as these have taken the initiative to capitalize on their fields of expertise, the retention of information they have to teach and share comes down to the individual. Whether or not the individual is able to apply the principles these professors have chosen to share, application of these concepts to life and philosophy in general is a difficult task in the modern era. I believe that is because, in some way I want to apply some of the blame to technology, but that alone isn't the root cause of these many issues. The root cause is the human condition. As I've aged, I've become more and more in tune with asking myself the very questions that life causes any intellectual person to think about, and this process is practically impossible for an individual to do on their own, unless they have been given the proper guidance. It is even more difficult when someone such as myself has endured the traumatic experience of my father, Michael Edward Cook, his murder in 1995, and the emotional abandonment of my mother, Fabienne Sylvie Kidwin Cook. Simply put, there are so many people born into this world who are expected to figure it out on their own without some sort of mentor or parental/guardian figure. And in this process, people are churned out in droves who have no clear foundation on how to manage their lives, feelings, or relationships with other people. That said, I'm going to cover the many things my friend Corey Betts had said, as well as his original post, and coalesce many of the points made by Corey and myself, as well as the aforementioned professors, into a series of concepts that may be fundamentally useful and productive in the field of philosophy, and even sociology. Philosophy. There's the Wikipedia link that I grabbed some of this information from. Philosophy, the love of wisdom in ancient Greek, is a systematic study of general and fundamental questions concerning topics like existence, reason, knowledge, value, mind, and language. It is a rational and critical inquiry that reflects on its own methods and assumptions. In my own words, philosophy comes down to the individual, asking basic questions about life and existence. These questions range from how much of something do I have to be or do in order for what I'm doing to make any sense, to how much bullshit do I have to put up with before what I do makes any difference in this world or the next. Those last three words there should indicate I've met a lot of resistance from society in general, and that I have come to consider that no matter how much focus and attention I provide to my writing, perhaps it won't be received in this lifetime, perhaps the next. I'm sort of exaggerating to some degree. In the Third Industrial Revolution, Professor Jeremy Rifkin talks about how the world is full of problems that have to be resolved at some point. Otherwise, humanity will be forced to gracefully welcome its own extinction level event. I'm not exaggerating there. I believe that at this rate, it is inevitable Unless, of course, I can make sense of all this, or someone else does. I am sort of making this a little bit more dramatic. There's plenty of drama involved, but I am, to some extent, providing some drama. Professors. Jeremy Rifkin describes himself as an optimist, perhaps being on the verge of utopian, though having a sense of being grounded in realistic expectations, knowing that his beliefs are shrouded in nuances and obstacles that come down to the human condition. George Carlin gets up on stage and talks about his observations and even frustrations in many cases, and explains with his flawless logic how things can be predicted and expected. In some cases, he says things that are outright ridiculous in order to create an incredibly powerful punchline at the tail end, one that causes the audience to realize his masterful application of reverse psychology. Jordan Peterson, though relatively new in the grand scheme of these guys, typically talks about how the young man has to overcome so much adversity in the modern world, and puts a lot of effort into describing many of the same things as George Carlin, albeit with a radically different delivery that is more understanding and direct and uses less reverse psychology. Noam Chomsky, the grandmaster in the scheme of things I've mentioned, really drives home many points about how the entire system is rigged in varying degrees, and that the people at the apex of leadership often fail to acknowledge their own shortcomings in exchange for publicity and or power. Robert Sapolsky, the neuroscientist, covers various elements of psychology and underlying disorders that are difficult to diagnose without proper experience, which requires years and years of study and mastery to understand and communicate. Many of these professors, as I consider George Carlin to be a professor, that I've rattled off, have shared their experiences in the scientific model and found ways to communicate their revelations with audiences ranging from the young and naive to the old and inexorable. That said, this rhetoric of mine is just a series of observations I've made by watching them all talk at length about the human condition, but it very well applies to existentialism. Post. Optimistic existentialism, Reddit discussion. I've seen many people say they have a tough time coping with an existentialist worldview. However, this is something I fail to understand. What could be more enjoyable than knowing you're in control of your personal life? Personally, I think it's the most freeing and happy philosophy. It would be depressing if instead I lived in a world where I wasn't responsible and couldn't have a true impact on my life and future, and have it instead decided by a deity, which is sort of happening. There is no happier philosophy to me than existentialism, so why is it some feel depressed about it? Overdose. The depression and negative thoughts arise when people realize the full extent of their responsibility, or they do enough research into financial institutions and the central banks managing $20 trillion worth of assets. You can no longer excuse your actions by alluding to some twisted fate or lack of control. Sometimes you can. Some people would be happier giving their life up entirely to fate rather than being forced to take responsibility for finding their own meaning in the chaos. And then here's Corey's post. So I came to the conclusion after basically a long-term ego death that I was in fact an optimistic existentialist. Then I also realized how many people could not handle that perspective. So during my readings I found that a while back and found it to be very insightful towards why others seem to not understand the glory of taking full accountability. Michael. Alright, so I wrote an essay to chime in here, considering I put a shitload of thought into this for many years. That's the same sort of philosophy I once had until I started scripting and programming. With a computer, you enter input and you get a predictable output. With people, if you give them input, you're really at a loss when it comes to consistently and accurately predicting the output. Psychology comes into mind, particularly state of mind. Everybody's state of mind constantly fluctuates, and while some may appear to be more stable than others, that's typically just a measurement of their quality of life, not necessarily their mentality, intelligence, or social ability. What does any of this have to do with being an optimistic existentialist, or just existentialism in general? Think about testing whether something exists or doesn't exist. This process is called validation. With a computer, validation can be pretty simple, but it ranges to being rather complicated depending on how much data needs to be processed to achieve the result. With people, validation requires so many more variables, no matter who it is, and a lot of assumptions or speculations need to be made in order to ask even the most simple philosophical questions to get a reliable answer. Economics, market analysis, and data analytics make people out to be pretty predictable. But it really is difficult to reliably predict everything about people's personal lives, whereas with computers, they do not have to balance a personal life and a professional life at all. So it is far easier to predict what a computer will do. That's because every single person falls into a spectrum where they believe they have free will to make decisions, or if everything comes down to a divine plan and everything is destined or preordained. In other words, nobody has total control over their own life, and trying to attain that much control displaces problems elsewhere that are difficult to detect or see, and it comes down to empathy. Our society teaches people to shut off their empathy in exchange for modern amenities. That's materialism. But in this process, everyone trades away their innocence to some extent. That's naivety. So that's why people constantly ask themselves, what's the lesser of two evils? That's justification. The answer? Well, not to make this entirely religious, but they say that God is either all-knowing or all-good. Superposition. That's superposition. Or it's a metaphor for superposition. If that is true, then whichever one it may be, Satan, the devil, is the polar opposite, entanglement. In my opinion, God is not all good. He is all-knowing, because you'll never catch him off guard not knowing what Satan knows. In other words, God's going to know what's coming. It's in his plan. Once you apply all this to existentialism, you might realize that being optimistic alone is a lot like saying your prayers or having faith or trust in others. Hard to do sometimes. Whereas being optimistic and taking action produces very different results. Whereas being pessimistic and taking action also produces very different results. All of these things apply to existentialism and psychology in general. The point is, being optimistic and taking action is pretty important, but don't take action expecting certain results, because Satan is going to come along and derail your plans. And that's exactly what a photon does in the double slit experiment. The act of observation changes the result. Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Corey. Michael Cook, I think almost everything you do produces different results. And your ability to absorb information also produces different results. That's retention and comprehension. A conversation you have with anyone, you can always learn something. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a conversation. It can be an interaction as well. Or, it doesn't have to have words. And it's always you that controls your actions. It's taking full accountability for all of your actions. Agreed. The thing is, however, in a social construct such as law or government, we still in some manner need to obey rules set down by our peers. Agreed. Which is respectable, because without laws, chaos can generate some dark corners. Agreed. Even within law, there are criminal activities that destroy lives that make living almost pointless. Agreed. Extreme examples, though. But it also occurs in many not so extreme examples as well. You do will things into existence, for the most part, but that's debatable. The problem is always time. There are many other problems, but time is a core component. How much time something takes is the key to success in anything, and time is always against you. People are also against each other, but I'll capitalize on that later. It's the key to almost everything you do, and all options change each day or month that passes. People say that you always have time. Not necessarily. But the truth is, you can die at any moment for any reason, with reason. Agreed. So the optimism for me comes from the fact that I believe in myself to make the best decisions that I can, and I accept that I will fail on the way. Agreed. There is no reason not to fail also, since most of almost all we do as individuals is blind. Failure is a key component of success, being willing to fail over and over until success. I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Thomas Edison. You can Batman anything and study the shit out of something that is within reason, since you can't study something that's newly discovered unless you yourself are fielding an expertise in it. More on that later. I intend to apply that to the professors listed above. So, being an optimistic existentialist to me means that life is clearly about your choices. And you can, in fact, make both good and bad choices. Everybody makes mistakes. You do control the choices you make to some extent, but it's not without the understanding that you are influenced by your environment. That's correct. That's definitely a critical point right there. And you will be mostly making choices in naivety. But you make choices. Sometimes there's just an illusion of choice, though. I believe in the nature versus nurture debate, that it's always going to be a mix of both. Humans are not born with survival skills. We just die as an infant without care. Hence why I brought up mentorship. So as we are taught, we are influenced, and only when we are capable of being more than that can we truly make a decision freely. Perhaps, but that depends. So we do have free will, supposedly. Robert Sapolsky makes a great case that we don't. We can rebel to all systems applied to us. Noam Chomsky makes this case as well. But ultimately, our choices are influenced within a spectrum of what we ourselves claim as individuality. We are, in fact, a tribal species. Falls under the human condition. We do better in groups, and the loners that claim self-made are always lying. I don't know if I agree with that. Completely. Maybe to some extent. We are no one without guidance and help from others, including any corporate structure. Not necessarily. That's why when others stand on mounds of gold, they usually tend to hopefully thank those who got them there. Well, Jeremy Rifkin makes this case as well. Perhaps in a utopian society that would be fun and well. But the reality is that there's no consistency in that outlook. Look at how much profit many companies are making versus the average cost of living. Walmart is a perfect example of a company that is raking in billions of dollars in profits, and the workforce is one of the largest dependents on welfare, SNAP, and other state-issued benefits. Jon Stewart talks about this with Jane Yellen. Inequality of the economy. The deepest of thoughts usually come from the fact that people think they're inherently good, and that evil is some sort of choice. People are in denial to think that they're inherently good. But if you study criminal psychology, you'll clearly see how crazy some of their environments are or were, and how easily human beings can be influenced to do horrible things to each other. It falls under the human condition, lack of empathy, societal expectations, and general psychology. We do control and have free will, but it's also a double-edged sword because we are not gods. Robert Sapolsky makes the case that we don't have free will. We are flawed, like all life. Nothing is absolutely perfect. But no matter what has happened, you can take full accountability for your actions once you are fully aware. Well, the question is, at what point does someone become fully aware? I call it ascension of the mind. Corey capitalized on what this means. Purpose is given to us by knowledge. Much less knowledge, much more wisdom. Seeking to become more than our animalistic selves is what allows us to become free. Consciousness. That's consciousness. We can be savage, no doubt, but we can be much more also. We can be, but observations of people contradict that to a large degree. And only in that path can you truly have an understanding of why it's best to always own your actions. It sucks when you realize you're the bad guy in your story. Explain. It's a hard swallow, but it's also the most important part in growing. You have to become more than those who came before you. I think that may be a flaw in the human condition to think that it's possible, but if that is what motivates us, sure. But within human limits. I guess you could discover forever youth or some sort of crazy eternal thinking. But the one absolute we all know is we die. So like Gandalf said, all we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. By Gandalf. Corbett, it's clear that you're definitely a critical thinker, which is really good. Too many people lack the ability or desire to express their train of thought or line of reasoning in great detail like you just did, and that is the reason why so many things are devolving into chaos. And I think that hesitation to do so, or the disposition people have, or the general taboo of doing so, is pushed down on people in order to eradicate their ability to freely express themselves without fear of persecution or retaliation. I think that comes down to the way the education system or society in general sort of causes people to feel compelled to keep their commentary to a minimum or be concise, or to think that it's bad to talk about these concepts at great length for fear of peer discouragement, alienation, or exclusion. I guess the case could also be made that just making the presentation interesting and entertaining, which I guess that is a balancing act in and of itself. That said, at some point I'm going to unpack everything you said because many statements you made I couldn't agree more. Problem is, many statements you made could use a little clarification, not necessarily on your end, but society's end. I'll capitalize on this shortly. Why are things the way they are? Or why are things society accepts as normal? Society can be reprogrammed, but it requires individuals to stop accepting the way things have always been done and to start having a discussion about what's fair or how things should be done. and this process continues to be institutionalized through government, religion, and etc., but the scientific method constantly causes these areas to require an update. Society makes a lot of assumptions. That's due to the human condition. You're right about how some people truly believe they are inherently good, as well as many other things that I'd like to quote. And that's naivety, though that ranges in its spectrum because in some cases that's malice. I will expand on this at some point when I can sort of document what you wrote and compare it to some of my statements and research. My point being, you're quite aware and on point with your rhetoric. But it's worth asking why many of your points are on point, which is the basis of philosophy and existentialism. Most important point you made is that taking action, that is critical. Corey. Michael Cook, I've been in debates my whole life against all sorts of stances because I actually wanted to understand meaning. Good, because a lot of people don't even bother or don't know how to. Not just meaning in life, but meaning behind almost all actions, which in the grand scheme of things is crazy. Life is crazy? I can agree with that. That's so much. So when people sit around being lazy, sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins, not believing there's anything new to learn in the world, I'm over in my corner always reading, discussing, and debating things. However, as I've gotten older, I've learned the art of getting to the point without being conflictive or disrespectful towards others. Sometimes you have to be, and the institution thoroughly discourages that. But that doesn't matter. People will take offense to anything, and if I alienate some ignorant individuals along the way, so be it. Capitalize on this, because treating people as if they're disposable allows the cycle to persist and causes society to be unable to heal itself, which is covered in the social dilemma. So it's okay to call people ignorant individuals. I do that sometimes myself, and alienating them. Try not to do that, because I'm not reading from the script, and I'm not adding. There isn't anything in the document. I'm sort of capitalizing on the many times that I've called people stupid. George Carlin did this a lot. People are stupid. Da, 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 da. Anybody can say that. Anybody can say that people are stupid. But the thing is if you call someone stupid, but they're willing to have an argument, and they have a good argument, well, try to continue having a conversation with them, because there's a lot to learn from somebody who's going to do that. However, if someone says something that's flat out false and just continues to reference that, that's a totally different story. And if you're going to alienate them for doing that, then I guess go right ahead. But it would be useful to tell them that they've caused that to happen. So educating people is pretty important. Michael, Corey Betts, that's good. Part of what you said. Part of what you just said relates to the 7 deadly sins, particularly sloth. Sloth is laziness. You're right, there is always something to learn about something, but the education system causes people to think critically about subjects that pertain to wealth, fame, and success. It does not cause people to think critically about concepts or principles such as morality, ethics, right and wrong, and etc., which is the point of existentialism and philosophy in general. The education system teaches people about 1, people, 2, places, and 3, things, and it often fails to teach people about principles or concepts. I'll capitalize on this later. Does the education system teach kids at school that if you have a lot of money and you throw it at a politician, that's called a bribe, but if it is a significant enough amount of money, it becomes lobbying, i.e. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, World Bank, Public-Private Partnership, World Economic Forum? These companies have sort of had a hand in a lot of that. BlackRock owns the 3 credit card companies and more than that. Everybody's got a credit score, and it's because the credit card companies are owned by BlackRock. They're a very wealthy organization that manages about $20 trillion worth of assets. I think they have $10 trillion in the bank, and then they manage a total of $20 trillion. And as far as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says, BlackRock has they own 80 to 90% of the S&P 500. I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't doubt it. No, the education system does not teach little kids about that. If anything, it causes kids to think that sounds very ridiculous. And if it were happening, then the police would have arrested them by now for doing that. Yeah, right. I shouldn't be laughing, but it's a sad state of affairs. The education system spams the shit out of kids with subjects that aren't sophisticated enough to staple together a reasonable argument about corruption. And that's what I've noticed anyway, the dichotomy of so many things, treating common thieves or overlapping subjects as if they're completely separate. That's why analogies and metaphors are pretty powerful tools to teach people stuff. In the end, the education system teaches people to worry about money first and people later. At least that's what I've observed. Discernment. So now that I've covered the post, some prerequisites for some of my arguments and counterpoints, as well as where I've agreed, I'm going to cover some additional concepts that aren't in the document so far. I've stated multiple times that there are other factors that lead to people in society acting and feeling the way that they do, and a lot of this comes down to lack of general all-around care regarding individuals, and that there is a very clear and observable level of control that people are expected to abide by, which circumvents every citizen's constitutional rights, liberties, and freedoms. And a lot of that comes from the British monarchy. Now, I've written about how the British monarchy still has a lot of influence and control over our society/country many, many times before, because they just couldn't let America win after the American Revolutionary War. Some people will flat out argue with me until they're blue in the face about that, but I'll make this argument right here and now. There are a lot of laws that limit people's First Amendment constitutional right to freely express themselves, particularly regarding decency, libel, defamation, obscenity, and things of that nature, though there are plenty of laws that limit people's other constitutional rights as well. I'm not going to go into great detail about that. But also, I like to use the analogy of how a canine can smell a drug or a substance, even if it is packed tightly or whatever. The police use drug canines to sniff the presence of drugs. Typically, this will be like at a border stop or like customs or something. And even if the substance is unable to be detected by a human nose, the canine's nose is able to detect the smell of drugs through many materials like metal, glass, or etc. The analogy is this. Sometimes people can detect when someone is bullshitting them, not unlike when the dogs smell the drugs. Jon Stewart and even Russell Brand talk a lot about how the United States taxpayers paid for things like the COVID vaccine, which the pharmaceutical companies were given that money to make the vaccine, and they made the vaccine, and then they made record profits off of that taxpayer money. That's one example. The F-35 program is another candid example of how taxpayer money is being, for lack of a better term, wasted or reallocated. May not necessarily be wasted. It might just be like going to certain people's pockets, like intentionally and very blatantly. And all 50 states have been making parts for the goddamn plane, which is billions of dollars over budget, years behind schedule, and provides less than satisfactory returns on the investment. Then you also have the amount of weapons, ammunition, goods, bombs, ordnances, tanks, helicopters, vehicles, construction, armaments, probably airplanes, and other military objects that were commandeered by the Taliban after the evacuation of Afghanistan in August of 2021. I believe it was August of 2021, to which the taxpayers shelled out over $1 trillion in the 20 years that we were fighting, we were in the country fighting terrorists there. There's a lot of cases to be made that the government is intentionally wasting people's money, and they come up with the most brilliant excuses to continue doing so, sometimes using Barack Obama's rhetoric, too big to fail. Here's the idea. I'm not entirely sure if that was Barack Obama's rhetoric or George Bush's, or I remember the phrase being stated a lot. Here's the idea I'm attempting to capitalize on. Our government wastes taxpayer money intentionally in many cases. The banks use fractional reserve lending to provide themselves with interest that the normal, regular, average citizen doesn't have access to, and it, in turn, causes people in society to feel stressed out and to feel as if their life lacks meaning, leading to my argument of them questioning their existence and existentialism. What is the point of the average citizen going to work, paying their bills that are already outrageous to begin with, so that some rich dude somewhere can splurge the profits they make on whatever amenities they desire? Meanwhile, most people are struggling to make ends meet. They're getting denied benefits. Some of the benefits people currently get are being written off or even outright refused. And even Jon Stewart, Oliver, and Stossel have capitalized on how disgraceful some government spending truly is. That's 3 Johns right there, whipping out the calculators and even their middle fingers in some cases. You'd think that after 1 John made a big fuss that they'd get the picture, but nope. Way more critical Johns needed, I'm afraid. So we live in a dystopia. We are supposed to have this idea of democracy, but from my vantage point, too many people are getting screwed over because they're not even allowed to know about many of these programs. And really, I don't blame every politician for things being the way that they are. I blame the lobbyists and the central bank to a large extent because a lot of that has been institutionalized by the British monarchy. You know, it's always you that controls your actions. No, sometimes it isn't. You know, maybe I'll expand on that in a minute. Sometimes what happens is that people in office take bribes from capitalists that are hell-bent on increasing quarterly profits or stock exchange portfolios. And then there's the high-frequency trading market, Wall Street, the speed traders. Here's how that works. Let's say that someone wants to buy 10,000 shares of Microsoft. When they submit their request to buy 10,000 shares of Microsoft at a certain price, the traders go ahead and they purchase the 10K shares of Microsoft, and then they scrape a certain percentage of those trades off the top. They resell them to another vendor in microseconds, and then back and forth, and then they make profit off of this trading back and forth. This in turn causes the 10K worth of shares to inflate up to a higher price, which could result in 7K shares being bought by the customer. So they went to buy 10K, but they only got 7K shares. You know, them doing this inflated the cost of the shares, and so they got 7,000 shares instead of the 10,000 shares. That's what the high frequency trading market does, and it's been doing it for a really long time. It sounds stupid, right? Well, that's what they do. They buy the shares since they're handling the purchaser's money, and then they do the same sort of thing that Sam Bankman-Fried did when he ran the FTX cryptocurrency exchange. In some cases, making illegal trades or real estate sales or side deals and things of that nature, or even drug dealers who distort their product in order to generate more profit. But the amount of time that this happens is microseconds. As far as the crypto, not the crypto or the drugs, the high frequency trading market. There's no way to regulate what's going on there because it is so complicated and happening at such a high rate of speed, and nobody knows what the hell is going on except the traders and maybe even the programmers and the bankers and the wealthy people that are responsible for doing all that. Now compound that issue across the board: government, Wall Street, corporation, industries. Microsoft wouldn't be the victim there. They're getting paid one way or another, though I'm not entirely certain if that they're not. The traders get their cut in such a small window of time. It's essentially like when the British made the American colonists pay for the bullshit tea leading to the Boston Tea Party. If this is happening all across the board, and the World Bank public-private partnership, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and others are involved in lobbying government officials, getting them into office and stuff, you have a system in place that is protecting thievery at the highest levels. And then you can apply the reverse concept of Ronald Reagan's trickle-down economics, and where this all becomes relevant to the conversation at hand, it's always you that controls your actions. Well, sometimes it just isn't. Because these things cause problems everywhere in society and limits people's opportunities, and and they feel like they don't have opportunities, so they're going to feel depressed. And some of those problems manifest themselves as a digital Frankenstein terraforming the world in its image. That's a quote by Tristan Harris from The Social Dilemma, though it's not applicable to that movie. Documentary is applied to social media, much less what I'm talking about. The education system does not teach little kids about how the system commits systematic extortion. That's the correct term for what's happening, and the entire system is rigged to a large extent, to the point where it is really complicated to try and tackle any single aspect of this problem, but it affects everyone as well as their decisions. You cut the head off of the Hydra, 2 more grow back in its place. The problem is likely to worsen, and expecting things to get better is foolhardy without action. The problem also applies to global warming, people's mental health, and well-being. The problem also applies to people's actions in life as well as their opportunities, which continually dwindle by the minute. Perhaps the only solution is to be born into a bloodline of wealth, and even then, the chances are you're looking at Professor Jeremy Rifkin talking about the Third Industrial Revolution. And so he says, the 62 wealthiest people in the world today, their combined wealth equals the accumulated wealth of 1/2 the human population living on Earth, which is 3.5 billion people. There's something really dysfunctional about the way the human family is organizing its economic relationships on this Earth. And that is going to directly impact everybody. Well, yeah, it will impact everybody, but by the way, that just so happens to be a rather alarming video, and it's 5 years old. I didn't add the date on here, but that's okay. But to take it a step further, some of the things he talks about are discussed in this video, Before the Flood, which is a couple years older than that. And things have only gotten worse since then with the pandemic, inflation, cost of living increases, climate change, heat waves, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and the like, causing chaos everywhere, whereby generating a feedback loop where everybody experiences further class separation, increased mortality rates, and etc. While I will advocate that we do have control over immediate decisions we make, I'm going to use the song Bullet with Butterfly Wings by the Smashing Pumpkins to illustrate the analogy. Despite all my rage, I am still just a rat in a cage. Ultimately, yeah, as far as being a rat in a cage, you have control over your actions in that cage. But if you're a rat in a cage, no matter how much rage you have, your actions are rather limited in scope. So, yeah. Some of these problems are addressed by the professors I had mentioned, albeit in their own ways. I don't think that any one person out there is able to get a grasp on the full scope and severity of how it directly affects every living person in the United States as well as other countries. But it also affects wildlife, the biosphere, and the environment, water cycles, business, trade, industry, commerce. I don't know. Saying that everybody is responsible for their own decisions is a bit of a naive outlook because the system institutionalized what I call modern slavery. This modern slavery takes opportunities away from the average citizen, and even though we do have control over our own decisions to some extent, there are people out there who sort of establishing a level of control that I don't really know how else to explain without covering several novels worth of information in topics that I don't have a PhD in. Luckily, I've already specified some of the professors who have. Anyway, yeah, I think what he says, where is it? It is always you that controls your actions. Well, it's not always you that controls your actions. Opportunities limit some of your choices, and the illusion of choice, manifests as itself as like you have free will in many cases. Which Robert Sapolsky talks about this a lot in some of his material from Stanford University. I believe that's where he made a whole bunch of open courseware videos. Anyway, that's going to do it for this particular video. If you liked what you saw, feel free to like, comment, or subscribe, and thanks for watching.